Hey guys, Edward here from Edward279, the mixed content creator. Now, it's almost a running joke at this point that us Americans, and Brits for that matter, you're not safe, always seem to demand that locals speak English when abroad. But when it comes down to it, Europe actually has a lot of English speakers. So in today's video, I'll be talking about the top 10 European nations with the highest percentage of their population that can speak English. So without further ado, let's get to the— Wait a minute! Now, before we begin, I should state that I am including countries where English is an official, or at least de facto official language within Europe, meaning Malta, Ireland, and the United Kingdom will all be on this list at some point. A beautiful country in the Alps directly bordering the relatively similar country of Switzerland, Austria, particularly the capital Vienna, is a major tourist hotspot, with Austria almost making it into the top 10 most visited countries worldwide. Link to that list in the description below. And because of English being frequently taught in school so that communication with English-speaking tourists is made easy, the country's overall booming tourism industry, particularly in Vienna, the Austrians' English is surprisingly good. However, that does not necessarily mean you'll be spoken to in English just because you're a foreigner. As while Austria's English skills are still better than most of Europe's, German is still the official language. So if you're planning a trip to there anytime soon, just please, don't hold your breath with just English and at least learn some basic German. Even so, Austria has the 10th most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, with 73% of Austrians having fluency in the English language. A tiny, often forgot about country right next to its much larger neighbor Belgium, Luxembourg is what I like to call a quote-unquote Frankenstein nation, as Luxembourg has lots of influence from more influential countries or regions nearby, which is shown by the fact that even though Luxembourgish is the main language in the country, German and French are also official languages and really common, due to influence from Germany and Wallonia, the French-speaking part of Belgium that borders Luxembourg. However, there's actually two other languages that, although not official, are surprisingly common: Portuguese and, you guessed it, English. This insane linguistic diversity is in large part because, similar to many of Europe's other relatively small countries like Liechtenstein and Switzerland, Luxembourg is a country of foreigners, with almost half of the Luxembourgish population being foreign-born, and as such, Luxembourg has the 9th most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, as around 80% of Luxembourgers can speak fluent English. A country very well known for being good with English speakers, it should come as no surprise that the Swedes speak some of the best English in Europe. But there's actually a kind of depressing reason why. And that reason is that compared to languages like English, French, German, or Spanish, Swedish is rarely spoken outside of Sweden, and since a lot of the media in Sweden is in English anyway, it pays to know English for much of the Swedish population. As for tourists, this can prove especially handy, as most tourists in Sweden, I'd assume, don't know Swedish, and the Swedes being so good at the English language means that tourists rarely have to communicate in and learn Swedish, although doing so is often encouraged. When it comes down to it, however, foreigners are rarely expected to speak Swedish, and more often than not, you can get by just fine with English, as Sweden has the 8th most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, as around 86% of the Swedish population bears fluency in the English language. Now, the Nordics in general have some of the highest English fluency rates in Europe, and Denmark is absolutely no exception. This is in part because, similar to Sweden's, a lot of Denmark's media is foreign, and Danish is seldom used in foreign media, which is predominantly in English. And so many learn English to adapt to the heavy consumption of English-dominated foreign media. But there's actually one thing I forgot to mention when talking about Sweden, and it's that just like in Sweden, in Denmark, it's actually mandatory for schools to teach both written and spoken English as subjects, and as such, is mandatory for Danes, and Swedes for that matter, to learn from a young age. And unsurprisingly, being taught English alongside Danish from a young age means that despite Danish being the typical language in Denmark, many Danes have excellent fluency in the English language, and you'll pretty much have no problems getting around with just English if you're a foreigner. Although, just like with the case of Sweden and Swedish, learning a few basic Danish phrases is recommended. Denmark has the 7th most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, as 86% of Danes are at least somewhat fluent in English. Although you'd probably never expect a tiny Mediterranean island to be on a list like this, Malta is exactly that, and today, English is one of the nation's 2 official languages, with the other being Maltese, both of which are mandatory school subjects. And while you'd think that Maltese would be more common, English is actually really common, being the written language of legal documents and being spoken widely, though rarely as a native language, with most Maltese people learning English from a young age because, again, English is a mandatory school subject alongside Maltese, and is one of the country's official languages. The other reason that English is so common in Malta is because Malta was originally a British crown colony, and English was already spoken, written, and used very widely by the time of Maltese independence, so it stuck around, eventually becoming an official language. Today, Malta has the 6th most English speakers relative to its population, with 88% of the Maltese population being fluent in the English language. The 2nd best of the Nordic countries and 5th best in Europe for English proficiency, Norway, just like the other Nordic countries, is very English friendly, and you can get around in Norway just about trouble-free using just English. This is in part because, just like in Denmark and Sweden, English is a mandatory school subject, but also because a lot of the media the Norwegian people watch isn't translated into Norwegian, and as such, Norwegians get exposed to even more English in TV and the media, which, unsurprisingly, are predominantly in English. That said, many Norwegians also regularly obliged to practice their English, seemingly particularly with foreigners, and it's not uncommon to see Norwegians switch to English when talking to foreigners, even if said foreigner is learning Norwegian. And because of all of this, it's unsurprising that Norway has the 5th most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, as 90% of the Norwegian populace is fluent in English. While you might not expect the Dutch to be this good when it comes to English fluency, assuming you're not Dutch yourself, sorry for any Dutch viewers watching, the Netherlands is actually one of the countries that are the most fluent in English, beating Denmark and Sweden and being tied with Norway when it comes to English proficiency within the populace. Even almost beating the United States, 93% of Americans fluent in the English language. There are a few reasons why the Dutch have English skills that are straight up unparalleled compared to most of Europe. For one, trade is something the Dutch have always done, both then and now, giving the Dutch lots of exposure to English through cultural exchange. Secondly, while the subtitles in Dutch media are in Dutch, The audio is in English, making exposure to English from media that's largely English dominated all too easy. The Netherlands has the fourth most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, with 90% of the Dutch population bearing fluency in English. As a nation that's ultra dependent on foreign trade, Iceland is a country where English is even more common than not, even having more English speakers relative to its population than the United States and being tied with Canada. Sorry for the many Americans and Canadians that are probably watching this right now. This is because, like I said, Iceland is very, very, very dependent on international trade. And with Iceland's population being so small, there is absolutely no way in Satan's basement that the countries that Iceland trades with would ever go through the trouble of learning Icelandic. Not only that, but Iceland is also massively foreign, with almost a fifth of Iceland's population being foreigners, making many other languages, but English especially, really common. Iceland has the third most English speakers relative to population, as a whopping 98% of Icelanders are fluent in English. Although Ireland is excluded by some lists like this due to having English as an official language, for the all intensive purposes of this list, I'm including the 3 countries in Europe that have English as an official language: Malta, Ireland, and the last country on this list. Now, the reason for why English became such a common language while the original native language of the island, Irish Gaelic, is so rare nowadays is actually really sad. But in short, Britain's extreme hostility to the Irish during the already bad Irish potato famine that was sweeping the island at the time forced many of those who didn't leave or die to learn English. Never mind the fact that the speaking of Irish was heavily suppressed by British rule over the island up until Irish independence in 1922. But Britain's linguistic mark on the Irish never really left, however. And even post-independence, English slowly but surely replaced Irish in most of the country, and today, Ireland has the second most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, with 98% of the Irish population being fluent in English. Finally, we get to the very country that spread English all over the world through its empire larger than any other in history, the United Kingdom. Strangely enough, however, English is not an official language in the UK. Not because it's not spoken, but because the UK, just like its much larger quote-unquote son, the USA, doesn't have any official languages. But if either the UK or US did, English would be it, or in the case of the USA, most likely only one of them. But official languages, or the lack thereof, aside, the UK was the original country that spread English around the world. First spreading it to North America before losing a war that created the US, and then to Asia, Africa, South America, and Oceania through Britain's ginormous empire, and finally spread English to the rest of Europe after said empire collapsed. The UK has the most English speakers relative to its population in Europe, unsurprisingly, with over 98% of Brits holding fluency in the English language. So there you have it, the top 10 European nations with the highest percentage of their population capable of speaking English. We hope you enjoyed this video. As always, make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!